New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the practice of chaos magic. We'll be comparing it to what is known as transcendental magic or high magic or theurgy. My guest is Ronnie Pontiac, who worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He has produced award-winning documentaries and has written articles for several esoteric magazines. He is author of American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. He lives in Los Angeles, and he is co-author with his wife, Tamra Lucid, of The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, a new translation for the modern mystic. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Ronnie. It is a pleasure once again to be with you.
It is always an honor to be with you.
Thank you. So this is going to be a very interesting program talking about the practice of chaos magic and comparing it to other forms of magic. And I know the starting point ought to be your late teen years when you were a member of what you call a nihilist band. And I think it would be very useful for our viewers to talk about the relationship between music, rock music, punk music. I'm not sure what nihilist music is exactly, but I really do have a strong sense that many musicians are very interested in the esoteric in one form or another.
I do think that's true. I think my example might be a little extreme, but certainly not the most extreme. So picture me with no social contract. I came from a war refugee family. My father would wake up screaming from dreams about what he had seen in war. And my mother went through an even more horrific experience during a war. And I just couldn't fit into the world because on the one hand, I was hermetically sealed behind their paranoia and almost a recreation of the old country in the middle of the new country. And at the same time at school, I was weird. I was a runt and I had a slight accent, and even though I was born in America, and I was relentlessly beat up and picked on in every grade. And I eventually developed in my teens a nihilist personality, and I became an avid liar. I thought that the lie was just so amazingly powerful, and you could immediately manipulate people and often get what you wanted. And nihilism was the only thing that made sense to me, because to me it was just a universe of utter chaos, law of the jungle. And you had to do whatever you had to do to survive, just as my parents had and my grandparents, and most of my family didn't survive. So this eventually led into a band. It was a natural place to reinvent myself and to start being the bully instead of the bullied. And I found a few musicians who kind of shared my dark vision of society and of the world. Oddly, for such different reasons. For example, my guitar player was every bit the nihilist I was, based on, like me, constant rejection and bullying and violence that he had experienced as a kid. But our drummer, for example, was this big, strong, handsome guy who had been so idolized by women and whose family had taught him that violence was how to express masculinity. And this led him to the same kind of no social contract nihilist view on life. So we had our very first serious gig being set up at a real club. And this seemed very important to me. I had been reading Crowley's Moonchild, and I saw the band as kind of my magical child. And I also had a book about Osman Spare, mainly about his art, but Kenneth Grant had written it, and it had a lot of information about his beliefs. And I was able to piece together on my own, prior to anybody calling it chaos magic, what turned out to be chaos magic in one of its forms. And so while my girlfriend slept, I sat cross-legged in a black robe at a window in the living room of her apartment. I burned black arts incense, and I gave the most primal sacrifice to imprint my will on the future through reality manipulation. And immediately weird things started happening. Just before the gig, my guitarist thought he saw me leaving the shack that we had been living in, but then found me inside. I had this painted statue of Anubis brought onto the drum platform. That was kind of hilarious because the fans later asked, "What's the rabbit-eared dog mean?" And our roadies were instructed to explain, "That's the Egyptian god of the dead." It sounded so dark and such gravity. Well, the gig was a huge success. It had sold out. There were many synchronicities that night, an ecstatic audience. Two rather fearsome biker gangs volunteered to be our security and were our security that night. I did this like Iggy Pop adrenaline driven punk dancing that caused people to describe me as possessed. The next day I was sore head to toe. And there were these weird tricks that happened. Like, for example, I was using a weighted round mic stand, and I had been used to throwing it down in rehearsal as part of the drama of performance. And I got used to how sometimes it wouldn't fall all the way. It would kind of fall part way and start spinning. At that point, it might either drop or it might come back up. So in the midst of this frenzy of the music and the crowd, I saw this happen, and I was in this acute awareness. And so I almost simultaneously made it look like I was the one that stopped it from falling and made it circle. And then my instincts were so in tune that when I gestured for it to come into my hand, it actually did. Well, the audience went crazy, whether that was a magic trick or it was powers. They just thought that was beyond brilliant. And everybody started throwing their fists in the air and screaming. And I went from we really, as a band, went from being a bunch of sneering freaks to being local stars in a night. I felt wicked and charismatic, and of course, that became contagious among the band and the fans. They all felt wicked, and they felt like they were charismatic. And I just got weirder and weirder behind this. After breaking up with a girl I'd been living with, I spoke with her on the phone for some reason, feeling I should threaten her with my dark powers. She'd studied Kabbalah already, and she scoffed at my idle threats. And some gathered up purity of malevolence just lit me up. And I still remember what it felt like. I don't know if it was a hallucination or satire or coincidence, but when I told her that she was going to see a demonstration of my dark power, a bunch of cockroaches started streaming out from under the cabinets into her kitchen as if obeying my will. Of course, she shrieked. And there I was, the Lord of the cockroaches, an illustration of how chaos magic can get real with you. And in retrospect, it's not a very proud moment for me. And I still wish I could apologize, but I can't explain what happened. But it's an example of this. And we'll see as we continue to talk some interesting quotes from people who try to explain how that happens. But reality manipulation is one of the more modern terms for it.
It sounds like, given the horrendous childhood that you had, that for all of its dark sides, that there was something liberating for you about chaos magic.
Absolutely. And I do think that it may serve that same purpose for many others. It's something it's a place to start. And when your social contract is completely broken, it's hard to believe in the harmony of the world, or that there's any kind of reason behind the creation that's unfolding around us, or that there's any goodness in people. So you embrace the chaos, and you embrace the power of this primal chaos that often in religion they say pre-existed what brought order and life to it. And in doing so, you free yourself of so much of the baggage that didn't work for you, and the frustration and anger and guilt that's associated with that. So it's a tremendous increase of creativity. And I think that, well, actually, I think before we talk about Austin Osman Spare, because he's really a key person in this whole chaos magic category. And he's usually described as the person who somewhat invented it at the beginning of the 20th century. But I would argue, and certainly I'm not the only one, that Paschal Beverly Randolph in the 19th century taught a form of Tantra that harnessed sexual energy and focused will for achieving specific, usually material goals. So the result would be a magical operation to invoke a response from the world that would provide you with the desired results. Now, it's not unlike witchcraft and hoodoo, these vast archives of spells that humanity has involving different kinds of rituals and talismans and lucky charms for love and binding enemies and luck and wealth and health and all the human desires. So we're tapping into something very primal with this approach. Randolph presented this power to manifest as a physical and mental law. There was no need for familiars or spirits or elementals or deities to placate or summon and command. The human will, when properly understood and applied, is all that is required. So without gods and the complications of theatrical rituals, magic got a whole lot easier to do. And especially once the internet got involved and you had digital sigils and all kinds of repositories of information, including on archive.org, the entire, as far as I know, opus of published books by Austin Osman Spare, which is pretty amazing to have all that available. It wasn't so long ago in the 1970s that it was almost impossible to come across any of his work. That was made the Kenneth Grant book so powerful. It was an introduction to the world of this obscure but influential artist and writer.
Let's go back, though, to Paschal Beverly Randolph for a moment, who preceded Austin Osman Spare, because as I recall, and you and I have discussed it briefly, there seemed to be some kind of a battle of magical will between him and Madame Blavatsky, of all people.
Yes, there's a persistent rumor in the world of theosophy, and among those interested in magic, that there was a long magical war, magical battle between Blavatsky and Randolph. And the idea was that somehow Randolph was a representative of the Western esoteric tradition, but Blavatsky thought of him as being a black magician, somebody who was working with very selfish currents of energy. And I'm not sure why he would be wanting to influence her, except that perhaps he felt that she had plagiarized him to some degree. It's hard to even use the word plagiarize, because in those days, even into the early days of Manly Hall, I would say, the feeling was that you were just grabbing gems out of lost works that no one was ever going to see. And rather than bore people with names that they'd never heard of, you would just quote the stuff pretty much lock, stock, and barrel. And you were doing a service to people because you were providing this wisdom that otherwise was completely unavailable. So she may not have really been consciously plagiarizing him, but there may have been ideas and even ways that he said things that stuck with her. And of course, she claimed to read the astral records while she was writing and to put down whatever was presented to her. But there was some sort of feeling on the part of Randolph, I believe, that she had used some of his ideas without properly crediting him or giving him some kind of boost. And he was certainly not someone that she referred to as being exemplary in some way. And so later in life, people would say that Madame Blavatsky would be standing somewhere and she would feel some weird vibe. And she said to more than one friend, "Oh, that's Randolph. He's sending magical attacks on me. He wants me to commit suicide, or he wants me to give up my work or something like that." And then she would explain that though she had no fear of such things and that they would just bounce off with a terrible price to pay for the person who had sent it. And of course, Randolph eventually committed suicide. So people within the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, for example, would point to that and say, you see, Madame Blavatsky's superior aura bounced back this malicious witchcraft, and it wound up reaping the person who had sent it. But scholars have been looking more deeply into this as academia has awakened to this subject, as we've discussed. They don't find evidence that this was going on. And it's surprising because Madame Blavatsky wrote down just about everything. And there's also no writing in journals or anywhere else from other people that seems to capture this. It's only sort of hearsay by third, fourth party. And then the other thing that's odd about it is that the claim that she used the N-word to describe Randolph, that what is going to get what he deserves kind of thing. Well, there's also no record of her talking that way, using that kind of language. And it would be unusual because one of her great dedications was the lifting of all humanity, that theosophy was for everybody. Now, they may not have had a very big following among African Americans, for example, but that wasn't because they weren't welcome. They weren't welcome in so many settings involving American metaphysics that I think there was the feeling that they probably wouldn't be welcome in theosophy. But there were Black theosophists, and certainly we don't have any sign that Madame Blavatsky was talking about people that way. Now, people point to her writing and they say, yeah, but she's an Aryan supremacist, isn't she? And she does have her whole theory of root races, and she has the Aryan race was superior at a certain point, and she predicts that the new root race will come out of California and will be a mixture of races. But it definitely can be described as racist, but not the kind of racism that talks about a certain individual using that kind of terminology. So I would say it's doubtful that it happened. But it is interesting that it caught the imagination of so many people, and it is an often repeated story about this dramatic magical battle.
Okay, well, let's move on then and talk about Osman Spare. He is a fascinating character, both in the occult world and in the world of art. He was considered a predecessor of the Art Nouveau movement.
Yes, absolutely. And also a very early surrealist, some have called him, although he's been called the last of the English symbolists. So in a way, he does kind of fit into all those categories without fitting into any of them, which is in itself an amazing accomplishment. His contemporaries saw him as just a complete outsider that didn't belong to any school. And his career began very auspiciously. He was the son of a policeman. His skills as a writer and an artist gained him national prominence when he was only like 15 or 16 years old. His work was featured in the National Gallery, and he was written about. And he gained powerful sponsors who helped him get the privilege of studying at the Royal College of Art. And there, a classmate remembered him as this incredibly handsome young man, golden and kind of long curly hair, and for the time, and highly intelligent, experimenting with drugs all the time, and surrounded by all sorts of women. He was just a dashing kind of figure. But World War I interrupted his career and his life. And he was an official army artist, so he saw terrible things. He documented such horrors as the wounded wearing gas masks in the trenches. And it certainly influenced him and made him into a bit of a hermit. And after the war, Spare experimented with the subconscious and the unconscious through automatic art and automatic writing and the use of sigils, including what he called the alphabet of desire, or his atavistic alphabet. And Kenneth Grant described this as, quote, a sexual principle. Each of these letters is a sexual principle powerful enough to initiate primal atavistic deposits in the psyche. So the idea was that there are these like primitive, powerful places inside us that we don't really have access to because civilization causes us to suppress them and forget them. But through this alphabet, you could reawaken and have these experiences. It would be so powerful. And this relates to how Spare's path began, which was when he was only 7 or 8 years old. He made the acquaintance of an older woman who was an initiated witch. And she worked with him for years and demonstrated everything from tricks of sexual glamour to explaining in simple language complicated occult mysteries. And she showed him dimensions of existence that few people experience, and that it was at that time almost impossible to find any information about. So he had his whole sense of reality bent, and she also introduced him to drugs, and this set him on a path. And his interest in sigils is something that's key to chaos magic. The practitioner captures the essential details of any given magical operation in such a way as to bind nature to respond to the human will. So, like Jung, Spare thought that the human psyche had below and above the threshold of daily consciousness these incredible sources of power and vision. But interestingly, he was not a fan of Jung or Freud, and he liked to call them junk and fraud. Except he had a Cockney accent, so it must have been much more charming. Spare was fascinated by the erotic, the macabre, the morbid, and the fantastic. His art seems to exist where the astral or the magical intrudes on the illusion of day-to-day consciousness. And it's his drawings are like dreams that you're watching dissolve or materialize unnoticed or flowing away. And he offered up a definition of magic that it is what happens when, quote, will, desire, and belief are aligned and in unison, unquote. And that's really an essential idea in all magic, but especially in chaos magic, where the feeling is that if you can just align will, desire, and belief, you can manipulate reality and get the outcomes that you want.
You mentioned that Kenneth Grant was his biographer, and as I recall, Kenneth Grant is a very interesting figure in his own right and was associated with Aleister Crowley.
Yes, and so was Spare. Spare was an influence on Crowley, and Crowley collected his art and published him in the Equinox Journal. Crowley even convinced Spare to become the 7th member of his magical order of the Silver Star. But Spare found that strict hierarchy and the meticulous detail of practicing ceremonial magic was not to his taste. So he never really got too involved in it, and he drifted away. And in his book, The Book of Pleasure, Spare described Crowley and that crowd of ceremonial magicians as, quote, the unemployed dandies of the brothels, end quote. He admitted, however, that Crowley was generous with money and courteous to him. And later somebody asked Crowley what he thought of Spare, and he said, he slipped into black magic because all he was interested in was himself and his own fancies, in so many words. So Grant was influenced by both of them. And Grant stumbled across the Book of Pleasure in the 70s, which is super rare even then. He found it at an occult bookstore where the owner kind of snuck it out from hiding and said, okay, look at this. And that started him on the trek of trying to find Spare. And he found Spare living in this really bad neighborhood, a kind of lower working class neighborhood, rough people, and living in squalor for the most part, to his shock. And but he learned that the people who knew him in that neighborhood thought well of him. And there was even a newspaper article not long after about him as this eccentric vagabond artist who had once had a bright future and who was known for rescuing injured animals. And there was a photograph of Spare smiling happily, surrounded by cats, cats like laying on him and laying on the bed, just all around him. It's one of the few pictures that you see of him where he's smiling, because in his youth, he was like this matinee idol, good looks, amazing. Today they would call it Chad, right? With strong, chin, and just beautiful man, but very serious in his pictures, very solemn. And then you see him in midlife, and he almost looks Hitlerish. He's got kind of a little Hitler mustache, even though he did not approve of the Nazis. And then toward the end, he's almost a Mark Twain. His hair is kind of long and wild, and he has a Mark Twain mustache. And I think that all those personalities sort of coexisted in Spare. So, for example, he wanted to bring art to the barren walls of his neighbors' houses. So he didn't show them his portraits of satyrs and spirits and witches. He would just paint nice little portraits of them for small sums of money, enough money for him to barely get by, but enough that he could buy drinks for his friends. Because the one way that he avoided being a hermit was he loved pub crawling. So he'd go from pub to pub in these neighborhoods. And he went with Kenneth Grant and with his wife, Steffi Grant. And they had a really influential relationship on each other. So Spare, who had tried to enlist for World War II because he despised the Nazis so much and was dismissed for being too old, during the Blitz, a bomb had destroyed his flat and took out all his art and writing that had not been bought or given to others. He was homeless for a time, and it kind of crushed him. But then when he made the acquaintance of Kenneth and Steffi, they were so impressed by him and so interested in his work. And so he realized that he could teach Kenneth, and they had a strong relationship with their mutual respect and admiration, really encouraged Spare to create new and greater works, including one of his masterpieces in which he tried to capture all of his teachings. And as he approached death, he gave up drinking. He gave up all his vices one by one. He stopped eating even at a point, except for very little liquid nourishment, suffered insomnia, and yet he was enthusiastically working till the end on his art and on his writing.
Now, you also mentioned at your late teen years that Aleister Crowley's novel Moonchild was an influence on you.
Yeah, the way that it's the use of sexuality as a magical act, and the hint that you didn't need a partner to do that, because I didn't have one that would be willing to do the kind of dark stuff that I was after. And so there were a few sentences in there that really spoke to me, and I did take the idea of, they were trying to, in this book, he was trying to tell the story of a couple that tried to create the child of the Aeon, the Messiah of the New Age, of the Crowley's vision of the age of the child. And that didn't interest me, but it did interest me that they were trying to use magic to create something. And I thought, well, couldn't you do the same kind of ritual for a band? And Crowley was so funny about sexuality. And, he had that famous saying that he was responsible, I think he said, for killing millions of babies. And of course, he was talking about masturbation, but he was misunderstood in the newspapers, and he was attacked as this, terrible Satanist sacrificing infants. So I became aware of that, and so the idea that sexual energy, creative energy, could be used for manifestation purposes suddenly dawned on me as well. Let's give this a try. Worked out pretty good, although my aims were low.
Well, At the same time that you, as a nihilist musician, had this interest in chaos magic, it was also flourishing in other quarters.
Yeah, exactly. It had been another person who was very strongly influenced by Spare and Grant is this British writer, Peter Carroll. And he'd written a book called Liber Null in 1978. And he followed it with another book in 1982 called Psychonaut. And neither one of them really made a big splash. But then they were republished together in 1987 as Liber Null and Psychonaut. And this became really a founding text of chaos magic. It gave you the how-to in a language that most people could more easily follow, because Spare used a somewhat florid, complicated language. And he loved to hide things in symbols. And in this book, it was laid out in a very systematic way, that could, almost a handbook of how to do this.
I gather in Russia, chaos magic took a foothold.
Yes, absolutely. And there's some really interesting stories around how, I mean, if you look at, let's spend a moment on the political dimension of all this, because this is something obvious. I know you've spoken to Gary Lachman about that, who's a wonderful expert on that subject and wrote a great book about it.
Well, and since you mention it, I will link to the previous interview with Gary Lachman about chaos magic and politics for any of our viewers who are interested and have a computer that can capture the link. It'll be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen.
That's great. So perhaps the most famous success claimed by chaos magicians, of course, involves the marriage of mean magic and politics in 2016 and the political fetishization of coincidences. You get this QAnon, but it's like almost like compulsive omen reading, or even apophenia, a condition that's associated with early schizophrenia, where you see meaning like everywhere, like everything's an omen. And people, when they're in extreme stress, will often turn to that because they feel so insecure about everything that they know and about life in general, that they need to have this sense that the universe is directly communicating to them. And I don't want to say that the universe does not directly communicate, because I've experienced that myself. But when it becomes obsessive and continuous, it can become a form of mental illness. And we saw on 4chan how this rather innocent cartoon character, or so intended by the creator, Pepe the Frog, was identified with the return of Kek, the ancient Egyptian frog god of primordial darkness, who was also associated with Cthulhu and these other icons of old gods, as Lovecraft would put it, who served chaos, not order. And a kind of mania developed in which, in the wake of Trump's election, a lot of people claimed that chaos magic is how he got elected. Now, really, there's a lot less mysterious contributing factors that we won't go into in any depth here. But just for example, Trump was taught by the notorious Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn's style is visible throughout Trump's political strategies. And there's also the Electoral College, which created a unique situation where the winner of the popular vote, once again, did not actually win the vote, and many other such things. But there was a kind of embrace by ideas associated with magic by people like Steve Bannon within the Trump circle, who were strategizing ways of bringing chaos into society and breaking up the order of the existing government, and creating something else through really what can be called chaos magic as social engineering. But I think a more interesting, to get to the point of Russia now, a more original model for chaos magic writ large would be Putin's Gray Cardinal, Surkov, Vladislav Surkov, I believe that's right. We must also mention, I think, Dugin, the philosopher who wrote a book called Putin versus Putin, which takes some balls, if you'll excuse the vernacular. Dugin sees America as the leader of liberalism, dominating the world with a degrading and degenerate ideology that is ruthless and soulless. And so Russia must lead the way in the fight to limit the damage that America can do. Dugin was influenced by Julius Evola, the Italian fascist occultist and notorious anti-Semite and misogynist, and also was very influenced by Stalin. So you can see where he's coming from. And he believes that Russia must create a hybrid autocracy that has elements of democracy, but is also a dictatorship. And it will be a more functional system, he thinks, and can seize the initiative away from American liberalism. And in doing this, the way to do it is to embrace the chaos of information war, to undermine elections. In Dugin even advocates nuclear brinkmanship, to threaten America with nukes until America backs down. And you see some of this rhetoric going on in the Trump campaign, I would suggest, where he's saying, there's going to be a nuclear war and it'll be World War III. And this is the kind of talk that Dugin also provides. But the expert chaos magician for Putin is Surkov. He was the first deputy chief of the Russian presidential administration from 99 to 2011. And then he was Putin's personal advisor until 2020. And demonstrated incredible skill in the use of division and circus to control society. So I'll give you a couple of examples. He would support both sides of controversial issues. So let's say that there's a bunch of modern artists in St. Petersburg, and they're doing really shocking art. So we'll begin by encouraging them. We'll give them money. We'll provide a nice venue for them to have a big show of their art. And we'll make sure that they get press coverage. When that happens, we then go to the church. We give donations of money and services to facilitate widespread protest against the Western decadence of these modern artists who dared to crawl out from their cellars and shared their degenerate work with society. And look, the press is praising it because they're part of this whole Western scheme to turn Russia away from the love of family and religion. And so one of the interesting things about Surkov is, and Putin too, by the way, is how influenced they are by American culture. So for example, Putin is a huge fan of the Beatles. And there's a story about how a photographer was sent out to photograph him for something, an American, I believe, might have been British. And he was allowed to speak with Putin briefly, and he didn't know what to say. And he came up with, "Do you like the Beatles?" And Putin ordered everybody out of the room except the photographer and himself. And he said in English, "I love the Beatles." And they started talking about Beatles songs. Surkov was in 2014 sanctioned and banned from entering America. He responded by saying, quote, "The only things that interest me in the US are Tupac Shakur, Allen Ginsberg, and Jackson Pollock. I don't need a visa to access their work," end quote. So it's interesting that they at least are modeling this appreciation for American subculture. But at the same time, they're trying to prevent that subculture from influencing their society too much. Now, Surkov, he fell out of power around 2020 or so, they say. He was being described all over the place as the mastermind behind the Russian political oxymoron that is sovereign democracy. That's a quote. That's what they call it, sovereign democracy. A weird combination of king and democracy. And one reporter wrote of sovereign democracy that it's, quote, "fake political parties, manufactured social movements, and feigned elections," end quote. And we see these sort of themes developing in our own politics here. And so the purpose of this extended chaos, you have lots of like silly presidential candidates like wrestlers or to the Russians, a housewife is considered comical, and they're given debating space on the main stage with the opposition candidates, and the whole thing turns into this wearying kind of exercise in false information where no one really knows what's true and everyone is arguing with everyone else. And the purpose of this extended chaos is to get people so tired of it that they're willing to accept order in the way that Putin wants to present it. And so at that time, he was establishing a new job title for himself, Supreme Leader, and he would stay in office for life. And the government and the Orthodox Church did many agreements with each other, and they became the protectors of the family. And what was accomplished was that the people who at one time believed that the corrupt government was the problem now believed that the problem was the influence of the decadent West. This was the same plan that the Soviet Union always followed. And there may be some truth to it, but Dugin says that Russia, he said that's fine for America, but Russia can't be a democracy. Russia requires a different form of government, and so do other countries. And it's not fair for America to try to force their style of government on anybody else. He also says that our style of government is an outdated relic from the days of the Enlightenment. So Surkov, he disappeared even more in 2022. He was the likely architect of the invasion of Ukraine. He was doing in the early 2000s these huge events with like biker bands and sexy dancers and light shows with 250,000 people singing about how Ukraine will be Russian again and doing these sort of rock anthems. And he was building consensus for the invasion of Ukraine. But he was arrested for supposedly embezzling funds from Russian-occupied Crimea. And he's supposed to be under house arrest, they say. But I feel that with Surkov, everything is questionable, probably a strategy, and not to be taken at face value. But he shows how this approach of chaos magic, which is based on, this is what's so ironic, postmodernism came from wanting to give people who had no agency, who had no voice, a voice. They've been marginalized for generations. And now academia was saying, look, one point of view isn't necessarily intrinsically superior to another. All points of view are valuable. There is no absolute truth. There are many truths. And this was so that we could see the world in a different way. But in the hands of chaos politicians like Surkov, postmodernism became this effective technique for making people lose their agency because they can't find any truth. They have no faith in the institutions. They have no faith in other human beings. And they begin to believe that the world is only endless conflict.
Now, I know with regard to Alexander Dugin that his political movement has a symbol which is pretty much identical. We'll show it on the screen here. To a symbol associated with chaos magic. There's a very distinct connection there through the use of a sigil or a symbol. Is the same true of Surkov?
Surkov was much more pop culture about it, although he would make references. Evola is somebody who comes up often among chaos magicians and amongst right-wing oriented people who have interests in the occult. So I think that, and he would use symbols. Evola kind of had the same fetish for symbols that the Nazis did, for these sigils that were supposed to represent this power. And so I'll give two quick examples of how that worked in World War II, speaking of magical battles, since we mentioned the one with Blavatsky and Randolph. So one of them is the SS, of course, had their double thunderbolts representing Thor. And this was a feared symbol. Their black uniforms of the Waffen SS, the thunderbolt and the skull and crossbones on the officers' hats, and all these symbols were intended to strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. Now, one of the ironies of World War II was that there was one force of Americans who the SS grew to be terrified of. And when they saw that they were facing them on the battlefield, they sometimes panicked. And that's something the SS never did. And the people that panicked them were Patton's Black Panthers, who were black soldiers, tank soldiers, and who I'm sure with their generations of racism behind them, they did feats of incredible bravery and self-sacrifice, killing these racists. And they actually put the fear of God into the SS, who called them black devils. So these black uniforms with their skull and crossbones, it kind of came back to haunt the SS in the form of the Black Panthers. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, by the way, did a wonderful book about them. And then the other one involves Crowley. And Crowley recognized that the swastika was a very powerful symbol and that it represented rolling forward, like rolling thunder, but things that just are rolling forward and can't be stopped. And he claimed that he spent a long time trying to come up with a symbol, something that would stop that rolling swastika. He finally came up with a very simple symbol, this V for victory, because he said that the swastika would be caught in the lock of that shape. And then supposedly he had already been working with English Secret Service type, spies. And he said to one of them, tell Churchill to use this symbol all the time. It will stop the swastika. And according to Crowley, not long after, Churchill used it for the first time. Who knows? Crowley made up a lot of stories, and he'd sure love to be responsible right there. But it's an interesting story about how even in World War II, there was this chaos magic factor that was going on behind the scenes. In fact, Dion Fortune, the great writer on psychic attacks and such, she was involved in a group she claimed that had been organized by the British Army to do counter magic to the magic that was supposedly being done by Himmler and his SS occultists.
Well, moving on, at some point in your career, you encountered Manly Hall, and he introduced you to an entirely new perspective on magic.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, how fortunate was I? I mean, once love entered my life, in the form of Tamra asking me for help, a story that I've told on other of our interviews, I lost interest in doing that kind of magic. And I was much more interested in just sort of being a smart ass at that point. But I was interested in learning more. And I encountered a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, an older copy of it, the small but large black and white tome, not the big, beautiful color one that he later gifted me. But this was an old enough book that it seemed like a wizardly book to me and it attracted my attention. And so as I was reading it, the first thing that I noticed was that he had dedicated it to the rational soul of the world, which was a mind-blowing and revelatory idea to me. I didn't, when I first read it, I thought it was ridiculous. But as I read his book and saw there the evidence of so many people who had dedicated their lives to understanding these mysteries and risking their lives by sharing them and capturing them in writing and in illustrations, I was deeply moved by that. And in the story that I've already told you about how I came to meet him, when I started working for him as his personal research assistant, I began working on his alchemical bibliography. He would recommend books all the time. That was one of my favorite things about him was he would write articles recommending books. He had a book recommending other books that was just so great. And so I knew that he kept Crowley under lock and key. And I once asked him about Crowley, and he said, well, he would have been the poet laureate of England had he not been mad as a hatter. But he explained to me that he kept it under lock and key because he had seen a lot of damage done to people who read Crowley's work and couldn't handle it. And I found that interesting. And so I asked him, well, what Crowley was the Golden Dawn, right? And what was he basing all this on? What is this stuff? And he suggested that I check out Eliphas Levi. And that led to him suggesting that I check out Marsilio Ficino. Now, Levi was a magus in Paris who was an influence on the Golden Dawn. Crowley liked him so much that Crowley claimed to be his reincarnation. His two classic books were Transcendental Magic and The History of Magic. And they're amazing books. He's a great writer. And Manly Hall really liked him and recommended him to people, which is kind of shocking since Manly Hall would always warn people away from ceremonial magic. And that's really what Levi was about. But there are these incredible depths in Levi's work based on not only his esoteric learning, but his deep understanding of Christianity. And so Levi, he was one of those who put together the storyline of the Western esoteric tradition. If you read his book, The History of Magic, he's listing for you all the influential people. It's almost like an early model for the secret teachings of all ages, or for the work of Madame Blavatsky. And Blavatsky quotes Levi quite liberally and also recommended him. So I started to read him, and he reminded me of writers like the great essayist Montaigne. He's funny, he's deep, he has a lot of knowledge about human nature, but there are also these great depths in his work. So for example, Transcendental Magic has 22 chapters, and each chapter kind of subtly relates to the tarot. And there's all these levels of meaning that one encounters in that work. And by the way, the Baphomet that most people think of as Satan, that figure with the goat's head and the human torso, that this was actually a creation of Eliphas Levi, who was a considerable artist and wasn't the devil at all. It was meant to be a picture of nature, of all the different qualities united in nature. And so I think it's interesting that in Ficino, you find this definition. He says the whole secret of magic consists in love. And that really struck me when I ran into it.
Now, Ficino is much earlier than Eliphas Levi.
Yes, about 300 years, almost 300 years.
He was a Renaissance writer.
He was really one of the great fathers of the Renaissance. His translation of the hymns of Orpheus, of Plato, of the Hermetic writing sparked the Renaissance. And he had among the friends he influenced people like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Pico della Mirandola, Lorenzo de' Medici. So all the leading lights were deeply influenced. And if anyone's interested, if they listen to our conversation about Orpheus, there's quite a bit there about Ficino and how he would perform the hymns of Orpheus for his friends, and they would come out of those performances just so inspired that they would work all night on their own creativity, and great masterpieces were born from all of that, including even the whole field of opera was kind of born in those days. And early subject was Orpheus often. So we talked earlier about how Surkov creates this world of conflict where you can't have faith in everything. It's just chaos. And you must flee to a strong government and a strong church for protection. And I find Ficino like popping up in the most unexpected places. So for instance, William Burroughs, who also wrote that conflict is what the world is made of, The last thing, and he was somebody that was aware of chaos magic and has been a big influence on chaos magic, especially through um, psychic TV and Genesis P. Orridge, who was someone was one of my followers of my astrology and a very interesting person. So the quote that was the final thing written by Burroughs 3 days before he died. He wrote this in his journal, and it's such a response to Surkoff in a way. He says, quote, "Nothing is. There is no final enough of wisdom, experience, any effing thing. No holy grail, no final satori, no final solution, just conflict. Only thing can resolve conflict is love, like I felt for Fletch and Ruski, Spooner and Calico. Pure love, what I feel for my cats, present and past. Love? What is it? Most natural painkiller what there is." And then he wrote in all capital letters, love. That's from William Burroughs, the ultimate cynic. And there he is at the end of his life singing the praises of love, and that it's the only real painkiller that he ever found. That's Ficino also to me. That's Ficino. The secret of magic is love. So I think Manly Hall kind of exemplifies that. For many chaos magicians, and for me, it was certainly it's something that it's natural for people who feel disempowered to do, whether it's hoodoo or it's pagan theurgists in the twilight of their religion, watching Christianity take over the West, and the word love too, and what it meant. And I know for me, chaos magic was part of the drama of self-presentation. It was meant to intimidate and alienate people who I thought were not worth interacting with. And I found that it could repel bullies. But then, preparing for this, I asked myself, well, what about, a good mother or father or a conscientious son or daughter, somebody like Manly Hall, is there room in chaos magic for people who don't want to intimidate? And I was able to find some examples of people who are approaching it as a way of living a soulful life. And I would use, for example, Michael M. Hughes's terminology. He's often referred to as a chaos magician, but he likes to call what he practices experimental magic. And I would say it's like experimental living, really, or experimenting with life. And once you've had that experience of life responding in a dramatic way, faith in the world kind of returns to you. So the first place that I experienced that was around Manly Hall. Apparently, when he was starting out, and he talked about it a little bit, Marie Hall talked about it a little more, and then others have written about it. When he was starting out, apparently he was interested in ceremonial magic, and he did some kind of experimentation with it. I was told by his secretary, Edith Waldron, that he stopped using ceremonial magic when he understood how damaging it could be. And then what happened? Because he certainly never gave up the path. And was he still on some sort of a magical path? I feel that he must have been, because there was so much magic happening around him. And I think that he was trying to live up to something, higher that was in the transcendental magic, even the way Eliphas Levi described it. So there's this great quote from Levi, one of my favorite quotes, where he describes what he thinks a real sage is, a real magician, a magus. What are the qualities of such a person? And this reminds me very much of Manly Hall. It says, quote, "They are without fears and without desires, dominated by no falsehood, sharing no error, loving without illusion, suffering without impatience, reposing in the quietude of eternal thought. The magus welcomes pleasure, accepts wealth, deserves honor, but is never their slave. He knows how to be poor, to abstain, and to suffer. He endures oblivion willingly because he is lord of his own happiness and expects or fears nothing from the caprice of fortune. He can love without being beloved. He can create imperishable treasures and exalt himself above the level of honors or the prizes of the lottery. He possesses that which he seeks, namely profound peace. He regrets nothing which must end, but remembers with satisfaction that he has met with good in all. His hope is a certitude, for he knows that good is eternal and evil transitory. He enjoys solitude, but does not flee the society of man. He is a child with children, joyous with the young, serious with the old, patient with the foolish, happy with the wise. He smiles with all who smile and mourns with all who weep. Applauding strength, he is yet indulgent to weakness. Offending no one, he has himself no need to pardon, for he never thinks himself offended. He pities those who misconceive him and seeks an opportunity to serve them. By the force of kindness only does he avenge himself on the ungrateful. End quote. So that's obviously a horizon, a horizon of perfection. Like no one, I don't think, achieves that perfection. Manly Hall certainly had moments when he transmitted errors or when he may have felt fear about something, but I'd never met anyone who so nearly captured what Levi described there, this incredible way of being. And what's interesting about it is you find something very similar in Yoruba culture. And from Yoruba culture, we came up with this concept of cool in America that is so important in America and eventually went all the way across the world as something that people were concerned with. You can almost hear Surkov saying, well, Tupac Shakur, he's cool. But Richard Irwin Thompson, in his book on the Yoruba, wrote this. And this, I think, is so much like what Levi just said about the Magus. Quote, like character, coolness ought to be internalized as a governing principle for a person to merit the high praise, Okan itutu, his heart is cool. In becoming sophisticated, a Yoruba adept learns to differentiate between forms of spiritual coolness. So heavily charged is this concept with ideas of beauty and correctness that a fine carnelian bead or a passage of exciting drumming may be praised as cool. Coolness, then, is a part of character. To the degree that we live generously and discreetly, exhibiting grace under pressure, our appearance and our acts gradually assume virtual royal power. As we become noble, fully realizing the spark of creative goodness God endowed us with, we find the confidence to cope with all kinds of situations. This is ashe. This is character. This is mystic coolness. Paradise is regained, end quote. So there we have something a little different than the idea of, gee, I want this car, or I want to make more money, or I want the perfect spouse, or I've identified a desire and something I want the world to return to me. Now, in transcendental magic and also in the Yoruba definition of cool, we are striving for an aristocracy, if you will, of spirit. We're striving for the secret of the golden flower, to awaken the higher soul. And then instead of moving through the world in anger or in fear, we move through it with a certain elegance. We have a presence that evokes from the world a responsiveness that convinces us that indeed nature has a rational soul, and that when we can be rational and we can find the right ways to enter into the dance with nature, our lives are no longer this uncontrollable experience of being ignored and finding no way to fit in, and finding that we don't understand what's happening to us. Suddenly we're in the right place, in the right time, doing what we can do to improve things. And Levi gave these simple instructions about magic, which I think captures this in yet another way. So, quote, everything is possible to him who wills only what is true. Rest in nature with a big N. Study, know, then dare. Dare to will, dare to act, and be silent, end quote. So these three quotes together, I think, capture what I've come to believe is the goal of transcendental magic, which is very similar to theurgy or to the Orphic hymns. It's to seek divine vision and protection, to ask for the grace of remembering that we are children of heaven. And so we don't do our ritual for material ends or cultural, political tactics or emotional compensation. We serve the divine vision. We reveal the true self. We bring harmony and healing to a little bit of the world.
Beautifully put, Ronnie.
No, thank you.
And I know we could go on and compare transcendental magic with chaos magic, but I do think this is a good stopping point for today. And of course, I hope we have many more conversations and we will have opportunities to go even deeper.
I would like to leave you with this one story for everybody, just as an illustration of transcendental magic. And this is about Ficino. I'm sure I shared it in the Orpheus interview that we had as well. Ficino was a priest. He reached a point in his life where all he really wanted to do was to translate the amazing manuscripts that had been recovered from the Arab world that included Plato, the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, and the Orphic hymns, just amazing material, the Neoplatonists. But where was he going to get the money to do any of this? He couldn't just live a life of leisure. He had to find a way to get by in the world. So, moved to ask for help, he performed what he called the Orphic Hymn to the Cosmos, probably the Hymn to Phanes, but it could have been some other ones as well. He performs this hymn, and he's asking for the cosmos to find a way to grant this wish that he has, to devote his life to making this wisdom available again. Well, unbeknownst to him, winging its way to him, and he would arrive in the next day or two, was a letter from Cosimo de' Medici, who told him that he'd heard about his incredible abilities as a translator and that he was singing the Orphic hymns and performing them on his lyre or on his very early guitar, which had a painting of Orpheus on it. And he says in the letter, please come meet me in Correggio. I'm going to give this village to you for your support, and my house here will be yours so that you may devote the rest of your life to translating these wonders of wisdom. And please hurry to us. We're waiting for you here, myself and my friends, and we wish you to teach us about what Plato considered a good life and to sing to us of the wisdom of the gods. That's the beginning of the Renaissance. That's a dramatic example, in my opinion, of transcendental magic. And of course, Ficino was a huge influence on Agrippa, and Agrippa was a huge influence on Paracelsus, and so much of what we consider the Western esoteric tradition comes to a great blossoming there with Ficino.
I think we should do a whole program just on Ficino.
Oh, we certainly could. He's amazing.
Yeah. He's such a key figure. I would like to do that.
Let's do it.
But for now, Ronnie, I want to thank you once again for sharing your passion and your wisdom with the New Thinking Aloud audience. This has been a marvelous conversation, truly.
Oh, thank you so much. It means a lot to me coming from you.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.